Welcome to my presentation on Rakugo theatre. I've always been interested in comedic theatre. I was inspired by a quote I read in Steve Allen, a famous American television presenter's book, Funny People, which he published in 1989, which says, "Without laughter, life on our planet would be intolerable. So important is laughter to us that humanity highly rewards members of one of the most unusual professions on earth, those who make a living by inducing laughter in others." I would consider myself to be a very funny person, and I aim to utilise this when participating in plays and performances. As well as this, the universality of both laughter and theatre interests me greatly, so I've always been intrigued by how comedy manifests itself within theatre all around the world. I was therefore eager to find out about Rakugo, which is a form of comedic theatre dating back centuries. I personally aspired to be a stand-up comedian and thought there was a beautiful irony in the fact that Rakugo is sometimes referred to as sit-down comedy, whether the positions of the performers are opposing, ultimately the goal of the two forms is the same, to make the audience laugh. I set about researching this tradition, mindful of how I can implement techniques and conventions of Rakugo into my own performances, in the hope that I can develop my skills in comedy. I read Rakugo, Performing Comedy and Cultural Heritage in Contemporary Tokyo by Laurie Grau, which is a study of the theatre form by an assistant professor of Japanese from the University of New Mexico. This is where I gained the majority of my information, but I also cross-checked and found information in Understanding Humour in Japan, which is by Jessica Milner-Davis, Fanning the Flames, Fans and Consumer Culture in Contemporary Japan by William W. Kelly, and Early Modern Japanese Literature, an anthology, 1600s to 1900s, by Haru Shirane. In this presentation, I shall begin by talking about the tradition of Rakugo, looking at what the cultural, theoretical and historical background is, and then I'll look at what exactly a Rakugo performance entails, practically exploring the form, and then I'll present a moment, looking in depth at a convention which interests me, and then I will conclude by talking about how what I've learned has impacted me as not only a student on the IB Theatre course, but as a performer. Theatre in context, this tradition. As I've already mentioned, Rakugo is a comedic form of theatre, and the name itself suggests so. The older term for Rakugo is ostabanashi, apologies for my pronunciation, which translates to stories with punchlines. Rakugo translates itself into fallen words, which refers to the punchlines which feature in all traditional forms of Rakugo. It's worth noting that there are several forms of theatre which have developed from Rakugo, which aren't inherently comedic, so don't have punchlines, such as Ogiyaku Banashi, which are musical stories, and Kaiden Banashi, which are ghost stories. I shall, however, be focusing on traditional Rakugo, as my interest lies in comedy. The theatre tradition finds its root in religion. Religion in Japan has always been dominated by Shinto and Buddhism, and Shinto is as old as the Japanese culture itself, whereas Buddhism was imported from the mainland in the early 6th century. Rakugo can be traced back to the 9th and 10th century. During this time, Buddhist monks used rhetorical techniques in their sermons, known as sekio, in order to engage and move their audiences, as many people couldn't read. Because many of them couldn't read, oral sermons were essential to the priests. To capture people's thoughts and attentions, the priests created humorous stories illustrating the thoughts and theories of Buddhism. Many of these stories were passed on by word of mouth, but they began to be collected in written form, known as setsua. And the earliest of these written collections can be dated back to the early 200s in the Ujishu Monogatari. Gradually, at the request of the daimyo, which were feudal lords in Japan at the time, the stories became more removed from religion, as the lords sought for people to entertain them. It was reported that after each major period of literary humour in Japan, it was followed on from a period of extreme political, social and economic repression. Rather than succumbing to these repressive measures, urban culture thrived after the reforms had passed. The death of Shogun Tokugawa Yoshimune in the latter half of the Edo period, which ranged from 1603 to 1868, marked a return of a greater freedom and prosperity for urban commoners, and a merchant class known as the shonin emerged, and theatre forms such as bunraku, kabuki, and Rakugo thrived in Japan. Now I'll talk about my practical research. As well as the books I mentioned earlier and websites that I looked at, I also watched many videos of Rakugo performers. The majority of these were in Japanese, as the tradition hasn't really expanded beyond the borders of Japan. But I did happen to find some that were in the English language, as there are a handful of performers that tour worldwide with Rakugo, namely Katsuro Kashi and Kimi Oshima. But I did find it really helpful watching Rakugo in Japanese, even though I was hindered by the language barrier, as I don't understand Japanese. It allowed me to focus on what the performer was doing in their movements, especially how they use props and listening to the variation of their voices to hear how they differentiate between two different characters. I've made numerous references to comedy in Rakugo, but what exactly does Rakugo consist of? Rakugo features a solo performer, previously known as the Hanishika, which dates back to the 17th century, which translates to storyteller. But as Rakugo started to become known as Rakugo, the performer started to be known as the Rakugo-ka, the person of the falling word. They will wear traditional formal Japanese clothing, which is a kimono, and sometimes they wear long, wide leg trousers. They perform in large rooms called yoseis, where they sit on a cushion called a koza in the seiza position. Seiza translates in Japan to proper sitting, and it entails being in the kneeling position with their feet in a downward V position, and they have to sit on the ankles of their feet. A female sitting in the seiza position will sit with her knees together, and a male will sit with two fistfuls between his knees, the seiza position. And a traditional Rakugo story lasts about at least 20 minutes, so they have to receive training in order to learn how to do this. I myself personally have not received this training, and will therefore be performing the presentation of my moment in the kneeling position, as it actually is quite painful to sit in the seiza position. As well as training on how to sit correctly, someone who wished to become a Rakugo performer would approach an existing Rakugo-ka and ask to become their student. And when they became the student, they became known as the deshi. The master would train them verbally by imitation and repetition. All training is verbal, and there were no written texts, as many of the performers themselves couldn't read. Often they would live in their house with their master, so their training would be 24 hours a day, and it was their master's responsibility to make sure that they understood everything about being a Rakugo performer, including the skills, manners and attitudes. And the master also had to provide them with opportunities for the deshi to perform on the stage. Typically training took about 2 to 3 years, and by the end of that time, a Rakugo student, a deshi, would have mastered several stories from the 300 traditional Rakugo stories. An identifiable feature of Rakugo is that they're limited to 2 props, known as the sensu, which translates to paper fan, and the tenujui, which is a handkerchief. These items take on several different roles in the play to help the Rakugo-ka express themselves and act out the story. For example, a fan can be used as a fan, or as chopsticks, maybe even scissors, or a fire perhaps, whereas a handkerchief can take on the role of a towel, maybe a book, bills, envelope, a bird even. And they manipulated props all the time to get the audience to understand better what they were doing. During a Rakugo performance, a Rakugo-ka will tell a long and complicated comical story that always involves the dialogue of at least 2 characters, and the monologue always ends with a narrative stunt known as an ochi or a sage, which translates into falling or lowering, and this is the punchline of the play. Rakugo has been described as a sitcom with one person playing all the parts by Noriko Watanabe, who was an assistant professor in the Department of Modern Languages and Comparative Literature at a university in New York. This is one of the reasons why I chose to focus on the convention of Rakugo, is the Rakugo-ka's ability to play more than one character. It also interested me so much as through my practical research, even though I was unaware of what the Rakugo-ka was saying, I could tell always when they switched between characters due to the changes in their voice and the slight turning of their head. In some of the performances I saw, the performers changed their facial expressions drastically, and some of them utilised their props to further differentiate between characters. A lot of Rakugo stories and punchlines rely on wordplay, and unfortunately this may have somewhat hindered the expansion of the tradition beyond the Japanese borders, as the stories don't traditionally translate well, as the jokes don't make sense. I've therefore chosen to present a moment which is not a traditional Rakugo story, but one of my own favourite jokes. I feel this is appropriate as it gives me an opportunity to explore the convention of playing more than one character, as well as other Rakugo conventions, as I'll perform it in the kneeling position, and I have incorporated the use of the two Rakugo blocks. The joke also relies on wordplay, and there is a clear punchline, which operates as the archie of the moment. It was my joke. Two Eskimos were sitting in a kayak. Right faster! I'm feeling a little chilly. What do you want me to do about it? I don't know. Make it warmer? How do you suppose I do that? Well, I say we start a fire. If we must. So they started a fire. Obviously, the fire burnt the kayak and they drowned. As they were drowning, the male Eskimo could be heard saying, "Well, you can't have your kayak and heat it." Thank you. Let's focus on the dialogue between, first of all, the joke is a wordplay on the popular English idiomatic proverb of "you can't have your cake and eat it." I thought in much the same way much of Rakugo stories link back to Japanese culture, I try and link it back to English culture. I wanted to focus on the dialogue between the two Eskimos when deciding how to combat the cold. I chose to have a female and male Eskimo, as that way I can make it more clear the differences between the two characters. The male character had a stern face, he speaks in an abrupt, matter-of-fact tone, and he has a deeper voice. I differentiated between the two characters with a slight but obvious turn of my head, and the female character had a stereotypical higher voice. I took inspiration from the videos I've watched by making use of the fan as a fan to show she was a female character. She was also sillier, having suggested they build a fire in the first place. I thoroughly enjoyed presenting my moment and believe that it would evoke laughter in many audience, which is something I've ever been doing. Inside. I gained a lot from my research into Rakugo, and it definitely impacted me as a learner and performer. In my theatre studies class, there were only 4 students, and we have recently decided that we were going to multi-role during our collaborative project. The convention I focused on, within Rakugo was the Rakugo car's ability to play more than one character, which is a form of multi-rolling, and I feel this exercise has given me an advantage in the skill. Many different forms of theatre focus on a performer becoming more than one character. From theorists to other traditions, there was certainly an interest in this convention. In Punch and Judy, a puppet and theatre show with roots in 16th century Italian commedia dell'arte, a sole performer and puppeteer, referred to in the production as a professor, must operate both puppets, and because of this, they must manipulate their voice. They do this through speaking through a device called a swazzle, which creates the rasping voice of the Punch. In Rakugo, which requires dialogue between the two characters, they can't use other devices, so they have to focus on changing their voice, and I thought this was particularly important. I felt the work of Bertolt Brecht links most closely with how multi-rolling is developed in Rakugo. Bertolt Brecht is a drama theorist who we researched during the course, and he championed a form of theatre that focuses on the alienation of the audience in order for the audience to become less attached to the characters, but rather to focus on the message of the play, and he called this the from dome effect. He did this through a range of techniques, including multi-rolling. The actors had to adopt a gestus for each character. This refers to the embodiment of an attitude. The actors therefore identify a character's base desire or emotion and focus on this when performing the character. It's therefore obvious when the actor changes between each character, they adopt a different gestus. These differences in gestus are marked by changing voice, movement, gesture, and body language. And the audience are alienated as they can clearly see that the same actor is playing different roles. I used this technique to help me develop the presentation of my moment, as I thought of the base emotion and characteristics of my two characters. In Rakugo, the Rakugo car is limited to the top half of their body, but this, however, can be an advantage, as more emphasis can be placed on performance facial expression, where attitudes and emotions can be easily expressed. While this combined influence of Brecht and Rakugo, I should be able to perfect my multi-rolling skills, remembering to focus on the techniques I picked up from Rakugo, focusing on voice, facial expression, and making use of props, using the methods of identifying and establishing a character's emotions and attitudes in order to embody them.